Welcome to the new video seminary. Here is Dr. Hoffman. Subscribe and give me likes. Let's start now. Countries engage in international trade for two basic reasons, each of which contributes to their gains from trade. First, countries trade because they are different from each other. Nations, like individuals, can benefit from their differences by reaching an agreement in which each does the things it does relatively well. Second, countries try to achieve economies of scale in production. That is, if each country produces only a limited range of goods, it can produce each of these goods at a larger scale and hence more effectively than if it tried to produce everything. In the real world, patterns of international trade reflect the interaction of both these motives. As a first step toward understanding the causes and effects of trade, however, it is useful to look at simplified models in which only one of these motives is present. The next 4 lessons develop tools to help us to understand how differences between countries give rise to trade between them and why this trade is mutually beneficial. The essential concept in this analysis is that of comparative advantage. Although comparative advantage is a simple concept, experience shows that it is a surprisingly hard concept for many people to understand or accept. Indeed, the late Paul Samuelson, the Nobel laureate of economics, who did much to develop the models of international trade, discussed in future lessons, once described comparative advantage as the best example he knows of an economic principle that is undeniably true yet not obvious to intelligent people. In this lesson, we begin with a general introduction to the concept of comparative advantage, then proceed to develop a specific model of how comparative advantage determines the pattern of international trade. On Valentine's Day 1996, which happened to fall less than a week before the crucial February 20th primary in New Hampshire, Republican president candidate Patrick Buchanan stopped at a nursery to buy a dozen roses for his wife. He took the occasion to make a speech denouncing the growing imports of flowers into the United States, which he claimed were putting American flower growers out of business. And it is indeed true that a growing share of the market for winter roses in the United States is being supplied by imports flown in from South American continents, like Colombia in particular. But is that a bad thing? The cost of winter roses offers an excellent example of the reasons why international trade can be beneficial. Consider first how hard it is to supply American sweethearts with fresh roses in February. The flowers must be grown in heated greenhouses at great expense in terms of energy, capital investment, or other scarce resources. Those resources could be used to produce other goods. Inevitably, there is a trade-off. In order to produce winter roses, the US economy must produce fewer of other things, such as computers. Economists use the term opportunity cost to describe such trade-offs. The opportunity cost of roses in terms of computers is the number of computers that could have been produced with the resources used to produce a given number of roses. Suppose, for example, that the United States currently grows 10 million roses for sale on Valentine's Day, and that the resources used to grow those roses could have produced 100,000 computers instead. then the opportunity cost of those 10 million roses is 100,000 computers. Conversely, if the computers were produced instead, the opportunity cost of those 100,000 computers would be 10 million roses. Those 10 million Valentine's Day roses could instead have been grown in Colombia. It seems extremely likely that the opportunity cost of these roses in terms of computers would be less than it would be in the United States. For one thing, it is a lot easier to grow February roses in the southern hemisphere, where it is summer in February rather than winter. Furthermore, Colombian workers are less efficient than their US counterparts in making sophisticated goods such as computers, which means that a given amount of resources used in computer production yields fewer computers in Colombia than in the United States. So the trade-off in Colombia might be something like 10 million winter roses for only 30,000 computers. This difference in opportunity costs offers the possibility of a mutually beneficial rearrangement of world production. Let the United States stop growing winter roses and devote the resources this frees up to producing computers meanwhile. Let Colombia grow those roses instead, shifting the necessary resources out of its computer industry. The resulting changes in production would look like this table. Look what has happened. The world is producing just as many roses as before, but it is now producing more computers. So this rearrangement of production, which with the United States concentrating on computers and Colombia concentrating on roses, increases the size of the world's economic pie. Because the world as a whole is producing more, it is possible in principle to raise everyone's standard of living. The reason the international trade produces the increase in world output is that it allows each country to specialize in producing the good in which it has a comparative advantage. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good in terms of other goods is lower in that country than it is in other countries. In this example, Colombia has a comparative advantage in winter roses and the United States has a comparative advantage in computers. The standard of living can be increased in both places if Colombia produces roses for the US market, while the US produces computers for the Colombian market. We therefore have an essential insight about comparative advantage and international trade. Trade between two countries can benefit both countries if each country exports the goods in which it has a comparative advantage. This is a statement about possibilities, not about what will actually happen. In the real world, there is no central authority deciding which country should produce roses and which should produce computers. Nor is there anyone handing out roses and computers to consumers in both places. Instead, international production and trade are determined in the marketplace, where supply and demand rule. Is there any reason to suppose that the potential for mutual gains from trade will be realized? Will the United States and Colombia actually end up producing the goods in which each has a comparative advantage? Will the trade between them actually make both countries better off? To answer these questions, we must be much more explicit in our analysis. In today's seminary, we will develop a model of international trade originally proposed by the British economist David Ricardo, who introduced the concept of comparative advantage in the early 19th century. The classic reference is David Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was first published in 1817. This approach, in which international trade is solely due to international differences in the productivity of labor, is known as the Ricardian model. Let's speak about the one-factor economy at first. To introduce the role of comparative advantage in determining the pattern of international trade, we begin by imagining that we are dealing with an economy which we call home, that has only one factor of production. We imagine that only two goods, wine and cheese, are produced. The technology of home's economy can be summarized by labor productivity in each country, expressed in terms of the unit labor requirement, the number of hours or of labor required to produce a pound of cheese or a gallon of wine. For example, it might require 1 hour of labor to produce a pound of cheese, 2 hours to produce a gallon of wine. Notice, by the way, that we are defining unit labor requirements as the inverse of productivity. The more cheese or wine a worker can produce in an hour, the lower the unit labor requirement. For future reference, we define ALW and ALC as the unit labor requirements in wine and cheese production, respectively. The economist's total resources are defined as L, the total labor supply. Because any economy has limited resources, there are limits on what it can produce, and there are always trade-offs. To produce more of one good, the economy must sacrifice some production of another good. These trade-offs are illustrated graphically by production possibility frontier, line PF, which shows the maximum amount of wine that can be produced once the decision has been made to produce any given amount of cheese, or vice versa. When there is only one factor of production, the production possibility frontier of an economy is simply a straight line. We can derive this line as follows. If QW is the economy's production of wine and QC is production of cheese, then the labor used in producing wine will be ALW times QW. And the labor used in producing cheese will be ALC times QC. The production possibility frontier is determined by the limits on the economy's resources, in this case labor. Because the economy's total labor supply is capital L, the limits on production are defined by this inequality. In blue field, ALCQC plus ALWQW is less or is L. Suppose, for example, that the economy's total labor supply is 1000 hours and that it takes 1 hour of labor to produce a pound of cheese and 2 hours of labor to produce a gallon of wine. Then the total labor used in production is 1 times pounds of cheese produced plus 2 times gallons of wine produced. And this total must be no more than 1000 hours of labor available. If the economy devoted all its labor to cheese production, it could, as shown in the graph, produce L over ALC pounds of cheese, 1000 pounds. If it devoted all its labor to wine production instead, it could produce L over ALW gallons, it means 1000 over 2, it means 500 gallons of wine. And it can produce any mix of wine and cheese that lies on the straight line connecting those two extremes. When the production possibility frontier is a straight line, the opportunity cost of a pound of cheese in terms of wine is constant. As we saw in the previous lesson, this opportunity cost is defined as the number of gallons of wine the economy would have to give up in order to produce an extra pound of cheese. In this case, to produce another pound would require ALC person hours. Each of these person hours could in turn have been used to produce 1 over ALW gallons of wine. Thus, the opportunity cost of cheese in terms of wine is ALC over ALW. For example, if it takes 1 person hour to make a pound of cheese and 2 hours to produce a gallon of wine, the opportunity cost of each pound of cheese is half a gallon of wine. As the figure shows, this opportunity cost is equal to the absolute value of the slope of the production possibility frontier. The production possibility frontier illustrates the different mixes of goods the economy can produce. To determine what the economy will actually produce, however, we need to look at prices. Especially we need to look at the relative price of the economy's two goods. That is the price of one good in terms of the other. In a competitive economy, supply decisions are determined by the attempts of individuals to maximize their earnings. In our simplified economy, since labor is the only factor of production, the supply of cheese and wine will be determined by the movement of labor to whichever sector pays the higher wage. Suppose once again that it takes 1 hour of labor to produce a pound of cheese and 2 hours to produce a gallon of wine. Now suppose further that cheese sells for $4 a pound, while wine sells for $7 a gallon. What will worker produce? Well, if they produce cheese, they can earn $4 an hour. Bear in mind that since labor is the only input into production here, there are no profits. So workers receive the full value of their output. On the other hand, if workers produce wine, they will earn only $3.50 an hour because a $7 gallon of wine takes 2 hours to produce. So if cheese sells for $4 a pound, while wine sells for $7 a gallon, workers will do better by producing cheese, and the economy as a whole will specialize in cheese production. But what if cheese prices drop to $3 a pound? In that case, workers can earn more by producing wine, and the economy will specialize in wine production instead. More generally, let PC and PW be the prices of cheese and wine, respectively. It takes ALC person hours to produce a pound of cheese. Since there are no profits in our one-factor model, the hourly wage in the cheese sector will equal the value of what a worker can produce in an hour. It will be PC over ALC. Since it takes ALW person hours to produce a gallon of wine, the hourly wage rate in the wine sector will be PW over ALW. Wages in the cheese sector will be higher if PC over PW is more than ALC over ALW. Wages in the wine sector will be higher if PC over PW is less than ALC over ALW. Because everyone will want to work in whichever industry offers the higher wage, the economy will specialize in the production of cheese if PC over PW is more than ALC over ALW. On the other hand, it will specialize in the production of wine if PC over PW is less than ALC over ALW. Only when PC over PW is equal to ALC over ALW will both goods be produced. You see the significance of the number ALC over ALW. We saw in previous part of our seminary that it is the opportunity cost of cheese in terms of wine. We have therefore just derived a crucial proposition about the relationship between prices and production. The economy will specialize in the production of cheese if the relative price of cheese exceeds its opportunity cost in terms of wine. It will specialize in the production of wine if the relative price of cheese is less than its opportunity cost in terms of wine. In the absence of international trade, home would have to produce both goods for itself. But it will produce both goods only if the relative price of cheese is just equal to its opportunity cost. Since opportunity cost equals the ratio of unit labor requirements in cheese and wine, we can summarize that determination of prices in the absence of international trade with a simple labor theory of value. In the absence of international trade, the relative prices of goods are equal to their relative unit labor requirements. In this part, we present the first formal model of international trade, the Ricardian model. It is one of the simplest models, and still by introducing the principle of comparative advantage, it offers some of the most compelling reasons supporting international trade. Our learning objectives are: learn the 5 reasons why trade between countries may occur. Second, recognize that separate models of trade incorporate different motivations for trade. And the third, learn the major historical figures who first describe the effects of international trade: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Robert Torrance. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if the countries differ in their technological abilities to produce goods and services. Technology refers to the techniques used to turn resources, labor, capital, land, into outputs, goods and services. The basis for trade in the Ricardian model of comparative advantage is differences in technology. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if the countries differ in their endowments of resources. Resource endowments refer to the skills and abilities of a country's workforce, the natural resources available within its borders, minerals, farmland, etc., and the sophistication of its capital stock, machinery, infrastructure, communication systems. The basis for trade in both the pure exchange model and the Hertzian model is differences in resource endowments. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if demands or preferences differ between countries. Individuals in different countries may have different preferences or demands for various products. For example, the Chinese are likely to demand more rice than Americans, even if consumers face the same price. Canadians may demand more beer, the Dutch more wooden shoes, and the Japanese more fish than Americans would, even if they all face the same prices. There is no formal trade model with demand differences, although the monopolistic competition model does include a demand for variety that can be based on differences in tastes between consumers. The existence of economies of scale in production is sufficient to generate advantageous trade between two countries. Economies of scale refer to a production process in which production costs fall as the scale of production rises. This feature of production is also known as increasing returns to scale. Two models of trade incorporating economies of scale are economies of scale and international trade. The last, fifth reason is existence of government policies. Government tax and subsidy programs after the prices charged for goods and services. These changes can be sufficient to generate advantages in production of certain products. In these circumstances, advantageous trade may arise solely due to differences in government policies across countries. In the real world, trade takes place because of a combination of all these different reasons. Each single model provides only a glimpse of some of the effects that might arise. Consequently, we should expect that a combination of the different outcomes that are presented in different models is the true characterization of the real world. Unfortunately, because of this, understanding the complexities of the real world is still more of an art than a science. The early logic that free trade could be advantageous for countries was based on the concept of absolute advantages in production. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, "If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry, employed in a way in which we have same advantage." The idea here is simple and intuitive. If our country can produce some set of goods at a lower cost than a foreign country, and if the foreign country can produce some other set of goods at a lower cost than we can produce them, then clearly it would be best for us to trade our relatively cheaper goods for their relatively cheaper goods. In this way, both countries may gain from trade, right? The original idea of comparative advantage dates to the early part of the 19th century. Although the model describing the theory is commonly referred to as the Ricardian model, the original description of this idea can be found in the 1815 essay on the external corn trade by Robert Torrance. David Ricardo formalized the idea using a compelling yet simple numerical example in his 1817 book on the principles of political economy and taxation. The idea appeared again in James Mill's 1821 Elements of Political Economy, and finally the concept became a key feature of international political economy upon the 1848 publication of Principles of Political Economy by John Stuart Mill. In his example, Ricardo imagined two countries, England and Portugal, producing two goods, cloth and wine, using labor as the sole input in production. He assumed that the productivity of labor, it is the quantity of output produced per worker, varied between industries and across countries. However, instead of assuming, as Adam Smith did, the England is more productive in producing one good and Portugal is more productive in the other, Ricardo assumed that Portugal was more productive in both goods. Based on Smith's intuition, then it would seem that trade couldn't be advantageous, at least for England. However, Ricardo demonstrated numerically that if England specialized in producing one of the two goods, and if Portugal produced the other, then total world output of both goods could rise. If an appropriate terms of trade, it is amount of one good traded for another, were then chosen, both countries could end up with more of both goods after specialization and free trade than they each had before trade. This means that England may nevertheless benefit from free trade even though it is assumed to be technologically inferior to Portugal in the production of everything. As it turned out, specialization in any good would not suffice to guarantee the improvement in world output. Only one of the goods would work. Ricardo showed that the specialization good in each country should be that good in which the country had a comparative advantage in production. To identify a country's comparative advantage good requires a comparison of production cost across countries. The modern international economy version of the Ricardian model simplifies. Two countries produce two goods using labor as the only factor of production. Goods are assumed to be homogeneous, identical, across firms and countries. Labor is homogeneous within a country, but heterogeneous, non-identical across countries. Goods can be transported costlessly between countries. Labor can be reallocated costlessly between industries within a country but can't move between countries. Labor is always fully employed. Production technology differences exist across industries and across countries and are reflected in labor productivity parameters. The labor and goods markets are assumed to be perfectly competitive in both countries. Firms are assumed to maximize profit, while consumers, workers, are assumed to maximize utility. Countries move from autarky, no trade, to free trade with the other country. In other words, what are the effects of trade? The main things we care about of trade's effects on the prices of the goods in each country, the production levels of the goods, employment levels in each country, the pattern of trade, who exports and who imports what, consumption levels in each country, wages and incomes, and the welfare effects both nationally and individually. In this way, we might raise the well-being of all individuals despite differences in relative productivities. Countries look to achieve a certain result, maximum output and benefits. The Ricardian model shows that if we want to maximize total output in the world, then we should fully employ all resources worldwide, allocate those resources within countries to each country's comparative advantage, industries, and allow the countries to trade freely thereafter. Labor productivity is defined as real output per labor hour, and growth in labor productivity is measured as the change in this ratio over time. Labor productivity growth is what enables workers to produce more goods and services that they otherwise could for a given number of work hours. How do you calculate labor productivity? You can measure employee productivity by the labor productivity equation, total output, over total input. Let's say your company generated 80,000 worth of goods or services output, utilizing 1,500 labor hours input. To calculate your company's labor productivity, you would divide 80,000 by 1,500, which equals 53. What is the labor productivity per worker? Labor productivity is the value that each employed person creates per unit of his or her input. The easiest way to comprehend labor productivity is to imagine a Canadian worker who can make 10 loaves of bread in an hour versus US worker who in the same hour can make only 2 loaves of bread. So what increases labor productivity? Labor productivity is largely driven by investment in capital, technological progress, and human capital development. Business and government can increase labor productivity of workers by direct investing or creating incentives for increases in technology and human or physical capital. So why is productivity important? With growth in productivity, an economy is able to produce and consume increasingly more goods and services for the same amount of work. Productivity is important to individuals, workers and consumers, business leaders, and also for analysts, such as policymakers and government statisticians. What is the difference between absolute and comparative advantage? Absolute advantage refers to the uncontested superiority of a country or business to produce a particular good better. Comparative advantage introduces opportunity cost as a factor for analysis in choosing between different options for production diversification. What is an example of absolute advantage? Absolute advantage refers to the ability of a country to produce a good more efficiently than other countries. For example, the Canadian economy, which is rich in low-cost land, has an absolute advantage in agricultural production relative to some other countries. A country with absolute advantage can produce something at lower costs than another. That country requires fewer resources to produce the same number of goods as the other country needs. Panama, a tropical country, can produce bananas much more cheaply than Canada can. What is meant by comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is an economist's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. A comparative advantage gives a company the ability to sell goods and services at lower price than its competitors and realize stronger sales margins. How do you know who has comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is when a country can produce a good with the least opportunity cost. In our example, the opportunity for iron ore is 1.25 cars in China and 0.71 cars in Australia. As Australia has the lowest opportunity cost for iron ore, it therefore has a comparative advantage in the production of iron ore. So let's summarize. A country is said to have an absolute advantage if it can produce a good or service more efficiently than another country. Consider the world where there are only two countries producing two goods, iron ore and cars. In the table on our PowerPoint slide. China can produce 80 units of iron ore or 100 units of cars, while Australia can produce 70 units of iron ore or 50 units of cars. China is said to have an absolute advantage in both iron ore and cars, as it can produce more of both goods. Comparative advantage is a little more complicated. A country is said to have a comparative advantage if it produces a good or service with the lowest opportunity cost. To calculate comparative advantage, you have to calculate the opportunity cost of each good or service. We need to calculate the opportunity cost for 1 unit of iron ore for each country. China's opportunity cost of 1 unit of iron ore is China can produce 80 iron ore or 100 cars. Therefore, 80 iron ore equals to 100 cars. We need to make it 1 iron ore, so we divide both sides by 80. We get that 1 iron ore is 1.25 cars. And now Australia's opportunity cost of 1 unit of iron ore. Australia can produce 70 iron ore or 50 cars. Therefore, 70 iron ore equals to 50 cars. We need to make it 1 iron ore, so we divide both sides by 70. Hence 1 iron ore equals 0.71 cars. We now need to calculate the opportunity cost of 1 unit of cars from each country. This is just the same process as before, but with 1 unit of car instead. For China, it would be 100 cars or 80 iron ore, and it means 1 car is 0.8 iron ore. Australia's opportunity cost of 1 unit of cars, when Australia can produce 50 cars or 70 iron ore, is therefore 50 cars or equals to 70 iron ore, and 1 car hence equals to 1.4 iron ore. Let's identify the comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is when a country can produce a good with the least opportunity cost. In our example, the opportunity cost for iron ore is 1.25 cars in China and 0.71 cars in Australia. As Australia has the lowest opportunity cost for iron ore, it therefore has a comparative advantage in the production of iron ore. If done correctly, China should have a comparative advantage in cars, as it is impossible for a single country to have a comparative advantage in both goods. For cars, the opportunity cost for 1 unit of a car is 0.8 iron ore in China and 1.4 iron ore in Australia. Therefore, China has a comparative advantage in the production of cars. If a two-way table showed the inputs, such as labor hours or cost to manufacture rather than production possibilities, then the comparative advantage is the one that has the highest comparative advantage. Consider the same example, but instead shows labor hours. In our example, we continue to calculate the opportunity cost as if it were production possibilities. Except for this time, we are looking for the highest number, as we are measuring inputs rather than outputs. The lowest opportunity cost is the one with the highest inputs. The opportunity cost of 1 labor hour of iron ore is 1.25 labor hours of car production in China and 0.71 labor hours of car production in Australia. As China has a larger figure, China has a comparative advantage in iron ore. The opportunity cost of one labor hour of car production is zero point 0.8 hours of iron ore production in China or 1.4 hours of iron ore production in Australia. As Australia has the higher figure, it has a comparative advantage in cars.
At the end, there is just to say subscribe and give me likes. See you soon.